Why is the humanitarian crisis in the Andes so invisible? According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the refugee crisis caused by the continuing violence in Colombia is the third greatest refugee crisis in the world. Over the past decade, Ecuador has absorbed tens of thousands of Colombian refugees, but the burden has not eased. When I traveled to the northeastern Ecuadorian province of Sucumbios, what I saw were 4 Ecuadorian communities that have, with great generosity, allowed thousands of Colombians to integrate into their communities and share their meager resources. In many ways, there is no way to the naked eye that I would recognize in these communities the greatest humanitarian refugee crisis in our hemisphere, namely the number of Colombian refugees in Ecuador.
Señor Presidente y miembros del Comité, en representación del
Chairman and members of the committee, I'd like to express my thanks to you for the space that you've offered me to dialogue with you about an issue that is so important for Ecuador and for the region, which is the impact of Colombia's regional conflict. I want to speak to you from the testimony of around 725,000 Colombian citizens who, according to the Ecuadorian police, have entered Ecuador in the last 8 years. To understand this panorama a little better, I'd like to point out some current trends in displacement of Colombians in Ecuador. A first element that I'd like to highlight is the problem of refugees doesn't just affect the border areas. The problem of poverty, which is accented sharply in the border zones, requires that refugees and migrants move even further into the interior of the country in order to seek better opportunities and survival. A second element is that the displacement happens principally in a way that is sort of permanent and without interruption, but in small groups. There's been only a few examples of massive displacements of large groups. Because it's small, the phenomenon of refugees becomes more invisible, and that in turn makes it hard to formulate programs of specific attention because of that respond to the needs of different groups. And the third element has to do with sort of the heterogeneity with regard to age, gender, and the region of origin. It's worth highlighting that there's an increasing tendency of the arrival of women and children in the last few years. And the issue of refugees, practically and in reality, is still really not a priority in the national agenda. And the focuses that have been applied by the Ecuadorian government to deal with the problem, they still view everything within the lens of national security, leaving the humanitarian drama aside. And we've got to recognize that since 2007, the Ecuadorian government has taken on some efforts to establish a policy in this respect. And there are some good, interesting ideas that have still not been able to be executed. Access to social services is plagued with restrictions and bureaucratic red tape that throw obstacles in the way of enjoying basic rights. And I'd just like to talk about the attitude of the civil population in Ecuador, since the presence of the Colombian population in Ecuador is giving origin to an increasing attitude of xenophobia on the part of the local population, which is sort of viewing that their workspaces or their ability to get a job is being limited by the presence of the Colombians. But the stigmatization of Colombians is even more serious when it's multiplied by the media and in the declarations of some authorities. The phenomenon, these sources will relate the phenomenon in their public discourses they relate it with the increase in insecurity in the country, an increase in crime. And on the contrary, they rarely seem to relate it to, they rarely relate increasing crime with the deterioration of socioeconomic conditions and the growing impoverishment of the population in general. And some concrete cases, I mean, they're often accused of being guerrillas, narco-traffickers, thieves, criminals, and when that happens, the Colombians confront large difficulties just in getting housing or in finding work. With regard to the labor market, the population is discriminated against with regard to wages and with regard to Social Security. Also, they suffer abuses from their bosses and from the authorities, labor authorities. With discrimination, the discrimination is also occurs in other scenes or other aspects in school and in high schools, where children and adolescents from Colombia suffer abuses and even physical and psychological mistreatment from their teachers and from their peers. And despite that, though, local solidarity at its most direct levels of neighborhood and neighborliness is what offers the minimal conditions so that the population can begin a process of integration in a new context of welcoming. With the lack of assistance from the state, the Ecuadorian population, the neighbors, and along with their Colombian friends, represent the only resources and support for the recently arrived Colombians in such vital issues as housing and employment. All of these elements, which are factors, which combine factors of the Colombian context and the Ecuadorian context, lead us to think that unfortunately in the next few years we're going to be seeing a humanitarian crisis that is actually getting worse. First, the international community has to seek help bring an end to the Colombian conflict through negotiations. Thinking that the conflict can end through the way of arms is a serious mistake that will only bring a worse humanitarian crisis. It is crucial that the United States ends its military assistance through Plan Colombia. It is necessary to put a particular emphasis on the defense of human rights in Colombia, and it is important that any negotiation includes the victim's right to truth, justice, and reparations. We need a large interagency campaign across the Ecuadorian government so there can be a rethinking about what the Colombian conflict means for Ecuador, dealing with the refugee population, dealing with other impacts of having this conflict nearby. And we also, the third, we have to remember that aid in zones where there's a high population of concentration of Colombian population shouldn't just be directed at the Colombians who live there exclusively. You have an Ecuadorian population too, and our compatriots say, why is this just for the Colombians? I'm poor here in my own country. So the approach has to be more global and must articulate both populations.
Well, we appreciate very much you being here. We're honored by your presence. We appreciate your work. One of the reasons why we're doing this hearing is because we want to raise awareness on this issue. You know, these are human beings, and you know, everybody is important.